Between 1949 and 1989, the Soviet Union detonated more than 450 nuclear weapons on Kazakhstani soil. Order of all the nuclear tests ever conducted on Earth. The data on cancers, birth defects, and neurological disorders in those communities is still partly classified in Russian archives. When Kazakhstan became independent in 1991, it inherited roughly 1,400 nuclear warheads. Nazarbayev gave them all up. That decision made Kazakhstan a model of non-proliferation. 30 years later, the world's largest uranium exporter is finally trying to build its own reactor fleet. 2 Russian mega projects remain on the books. Both depend on Russian financing. That is, at minimum, an open question. I'm Bruce Pannier. I spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we break down the geopolitics of Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. If you're new here and want more analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's get into it. To understand what nuclear energy means to Kazakhstan today, you have to understand what nuclear weapons did to Kazakhstan before. In 1947, Soviet security chief Lavrentiy Beria was tasked with building the USSR's first atomic bomb test site. He surveyed the map, identified a stretch of steppe in northeastern Kazakhstan, and declared the area, in his words, uninhabited. He was wrong. The Semipalatinsk test site, known in Russia simply as Polygon, covered 18,500 square kilometers. It sat 120 kilometers from the city of Semipalatinsk, now called Semey, and within fallout range of dozens of rural communities, smaller towns, and villages scattered across northern and eastern Kazakhstan. The Soviet state knew people lived there. It tested anyway. On August 29, 1949, the first device detonated. Codenamed Первая Молния, First Lightning. It released 22 kilotons of energy into the atmosphere. The United States called it Joe 1 after Stalin. Over the next 4 decades, more than 450 more tests followed. The people living near the polygon were not told they were beside a nuclear test site. Soviet authorities told them the periodic explosions were earthquakes. Villagers were sometimes ordered outside and instructed to crouch in ditches. Children were covered with felt by teachers who sensed something was wrong, though they didn't know exactly what. A research institution called Anti-Brucellosis Dispensary No. 4, ostensibly studying a cattle disease, was in reality monitoring how radiation affected the surrounding human population. The testing moved underground after 1963 international ban on atmospheric tests, but the damage had been accumulating for more than a decade. Studies documented elevated cancer rates, neurological disorders, and birth defects in communities surrounding the polygon, including in children born years after the last detonation. The Soviet Union kept the data classified. Much of it remains inaccessible in archives in Moscow.
Всего на территории нашей страны произведено почти 500 атмосферных, надземных и подземных испытаний военного и так называемого мирного назначения. Это половина всех испытаний, проведенных в мире за все время существования ядерного оружия. Ядерный молох искалечил судьбы, подорвал здоровье более 1,5 миллиона казахстанцев, живших вокруг полигона. Последствия ядерных испытаний ощущаются по сей день.
When Mikhail Gorbachev launched his glasnost reforms in the mid-1980s, it cracked open something that had been sealed shut in Kazakhstan for decades. A radioactive gas leak from Semipalatinsk in 1989 triggered public outrage that the Soviet censors could no longer suppress.
Последней каплей для нас стало последнее атомное испытание на полигоне под Семипалатинск.
A poet named Olja Suleimanov organized mass rallies. The movement that emerged was called Nevada Semipalatinsk, named after both the Soviet and American test sites. It drew an explicit parallel. The people of Nevada had also lived downwind from the weapons their government told them were safe. The message resonated globally.
Казахстан стал как бы лидером антиядерного движения в мире благодаря Неваде Семипалатинск. Да, народ остановил испытания, народ закрыл полигон, помог.
The movement gained powerful political backing. Nursultan Nazarbayev, then the Communist Party chief of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic and soon to be the country's first president, threw his support behind it. On August 29, 1991, exactly 42 years after the first detonation, Nazarbayev signed a decree closing Polygon forever. It was one of the final significant acts before Kazakhstan declared independence 3 months later. Independence brought Kazakhstan a problem that no newly sovereign country had ever faced quite this way before. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan didn't just inherit a piece of steppe that had been used for testing, it inherited the weapons themselves. Roughly 1,400 nuclear warheads, along with tactical weapons, were stationed on Kazakhstani territory. By arsenal size, Kazakhstan was, overnight, the fourth largest nuclear power on Earth. Ahead of the United Kingdom, ahead of France, ahead of China. What Nazarbayev decided to do with that arsenal shaped the country's international identity for the next 3 decades. The conventional wisdom looking back is that Kazakhstan's denuclearization was straightforward. It wasn't. There were factions within Kazakhstan's emerging political establishment who argued the arsenal was a strategic asset, leverage against Russia, a deterrent, a bargaining chip. Kazakhstan shared long borders with 2 nuclear-armed states, Russia to the north, China to the east. Some thought the weapons were worth keeping. Nazarbayev made the opposite calculation. He concluded that the weapons created risk rather than security. The risk of accidents, the risk of conflict, the risk of being seen as a proliferation threat by the West at the exact moment Kazakhstan was trying to build economic partnerships with Western capitals and international institutions.
Я убежден, что экзотике ядерных зонтов не должно быть места в мире будущего. Безнравственно вопросы ядерной безопасности делать разменной монетой при решении других проблем межгосударственных взаимоотношений.
He signed the Lisbon Protocol in 1992, committing Kazakhstan to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state. In December 1993, the Kazakhstani parliament ratified the NPT in a vote of 283 to 1. By April 1995, all nuclear warheads had been transferred to Russia. By August 1996, the last of the 104 SS-18 intercontinental ballistic missile silos had been destroyed. The United States rewarded Kazakhstan's cooperation through the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, funding silo destruction, securing nuclear materials, and providing diplomatic recognition.
We have just transferred approximately 600 kilograms of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium out of Kazakhstan at the request of the government of Kazakhstan and delivered the material to the Department of Energy's Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge in Tennessee for safe and secure storage.
Kazakhstan became a case study in successful denuclearization, cited in non-proliferation policy for decades afterwards. And the principle Nazarbayev established didn't stay in the 1990s. His successor, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, carried it forward as an explicit foreign policy doctrine and tested it directly against Russia. At the Valdai Discussion Club in October 2019, Tokayev stated plainly that nuclear weapons don't guarantee a state's security.
Обладание ядерным оружием в современном мире – это не есть гарантия безопасности и особенно экономического процветания. Иногда лучше не иметь ядерное оружие, но зато привлекать больше инвестиций в свою экономику, поддерживать и развивать хорошие отношения со всеми государствами мира, что делает Казахстан на практике.
Vladimir Putin responded with a joke.
Саддам Хусейн тоже так думал.
The implication was unmistakable. States that give up their leverage pay a price. Tokayev didn't walk it back. Kazakhstan's anti-nuclear position has been a consistent state principle across 2 presidencies, and Astana has made clear it intends to keep it that way, regardless of how Moscow characterizes the choice. And Semipalatinsk became a symbol, not just of Soviet nuclear harm, but of Kazakhstan's deliberate choice to step away from weapons and towards something else. The country has hosted international conferences on nuclear testing, championed a Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, agreed to host IAEA low-enriched uranium bank at the Alba metallurgical plant, and invested heavily in its global reputation as a responsible nuclear steward. Here's what often gets left out of Kazakhstan's nuclear story. The country didn't step away from nuclear material, it stepped away from nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan sits on some of the largest uranium reserves on Earth, roughly 12% of global uranium resources lie beneath Kazakhstani soil. Kazatomprom, the state atomic company, became the world's largest uranium producer. By 2009, Kazakhstan had overtaken Canada. Today it produces more uranium than any other country, supplying fuel for nuclear reactors across Asia, Europe, and North America. Uranium is Kazakhstan's quiet strategic commodity. It generates significant export revenue and gives Astana a form of leverage, subtle, rarely discussed publicly, but real, in its relations with major nuclear powers who depend on Kazakhstani supply chains. Kazakhstan's uranium industry also became a geopolitical arena. Russia, France, Canada, China, Japan, and the United States have all competed for stakes in Kazakhstani uranium mining through joint ventures with Kazatomprom. Russia was an early and significant partner, supplying enrichment services, operating joint ventures, and maintaining deep institutional ties from the Soviet era. China moved aggressively in the 2000s, establishing joint ventures and securing long-term supply agreements. The Kazakh-Chinese nuclear relationship expanded steadily throughout the following decade. What Kazakhstan did not have, despite being the world's largest uranium exporter, was a domestic nuclear power plant. That gap, and the effort to close it, brings us to the present. Kazakhstan's power grid is in trouble. The country's energy infrastructure dates largely from the Soviet era, when plants were built for a different industrial economy and a different population distribution. The average combined heat and power plant in Kazakhstan, the facilities that provide both electricity and district heating to cities, was 61 years old as of recent estimates. Roughly 76% had been in operating for more than 50 years.
Как зимовать будем, я не знаю. Оборудование уже все старое, ничего не выдерживает, везде все бежит.
The consequences have now been abstract. Between 2022 and 2023, serious accidents struck multiple facilities across the country. In the city of Rudny, a heating network failure in February 2023 left dozens of buildings without heat and triggered a local state of emergency. Private owners of several plants have invested almost nothing in the modernization over the prior decades. Electricity deficits grew, and by 2025, Kazakhstan was significantly increasing electricity imports from Russia, primarily to cover peak consumption shortfalls at elevated prices. The government responded with an ambitious infrastructure program. A national project for modernization of the energy and utilities sector was adopted from 2025 to 2029. A second program focused on coal-fired generation from 2026 to 2030. Foreign investment was actively sought. And for its first nuclear power plant, a project under discussion for decades, Kazakhstan turned to Russia's Rosatom. The logic was familiar. Russia had built nuclear reactors across the former Soviet space and beyond. Rosatom had an existing relationship with Kazakhstan through uranium enrichment and fuel cycle services, and Russia was offering preferential export financing, a state-backed loan structure that other potential suppliers weren't matching. The planned plant would consist of two VVER 1200 reactor units, producing 2.4 gigawatts of electricity in total. Construction was set to begin in 2029, with completion targeted for 2035 to 2036. The most recent cost estimate stands at $15 billion, up significantly from an initial projection of $10 billion. Russia pledged to cover the financing gap through preferential export credit. But before we examine whether Rosatom can actually deliver that plant, a more recent episode offers a useful frame. In 2023, Kazakhstan and Russia formalized an agreement to build 3 combined heat and power plants, CHPs, in the cities of Kokshetau, Semey, and Ust-Kamenogorsk. These plants were not peripheral projects. They were a response to an acute crisis, aging heating infrastructure serving real populations. Samruk-Energo, a subsidiary of Kazakhstan's National Wealth Fund, was designated as the Kazakhstani partner. Inter-RAO Export was the Russian counterpart. Financing was to come through a preferential Russian export credit tied to the supply of Russian equipment, the same basic structure being offered for the nuclear power plant. Then negotiations stalled. Then they stalled again. Kazakhstan's energy ministry acknowledged difficulties from the outset, noting that international financial institutions had refused to fund coal-fired generation, precisely the constraint that had pushed Kazakhstan toward inter-RAO in the first place. But Russia never provided firm financing guarantees. By mid-2025, Kazakhstan's new energy minister declared that construction could proceed without Russia if talks collapsed. By July 2025, work on the Kokshetau plant had already begun, without Russian participation. President Tokayev publicly criticized the delays in January 2026.
Мемлекет басшысы үкіметтің алдына өте ауқымды міндет қойып отыр. Яғни 2035 жылға дейін жалпы қуаты 26 гигаватт болатын жаңа энергия көздерін іске қосуымыз керек.
Prime Minister Olja Spektenov directed Samruk Kasina to finalize contracts for all 3 cities by the end of January 2026.
Аталған міндеттерді жүзеге асыру еліміздің барлық өңірін энергиямен сенімді түрде қамтамасыз етуге мүмкіндік береді.
They did. The new consortium leading the construction is Kazakh-Singaporean. The technology is Chinese. Why did Russia fail to deliver on 3 comparatively modest power plant projects? Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russian energy companies have lost access to cheap Western capital. They face secondary sanction risks on foreign projects. They're operating under deepening financial strain at home, compounded by military expenditures, and they confront a specific equipment problem. The turbines and control systems required for modern power plant construction largely depend on Western components now subject to restricted access. There was also a structural misalignment in what each side wanted. Russia was being asked to finance and build 3 plants without receiving equity stakes. Kazakhstan wanted fast preferential financing for an energy emergency. Russia wanted guaranteed returns and cost recovery through tariff revenues. Kazakhstan's government is deeply reluctant to raise electricity and heating tariffs, a politically sensitive issue ahead of what Satpayev described as an approaching political transition. Without tariff increases, project viability was doubtful. The result? Russia couldn't build 3 power plants in Kazakhstan's cities. The question Satpayev poses directly in his analysis is the one we're going to sit with for the rest of this video. If Russia couldn't build power plants, can it build a reactor?
Атом электр станциясын салу немесе салмау мәселесі. Бұл еліміздің болашағына қатысты аса маңызды мәселе. Сондықтан оны жалпы ұлттық референдум арқылы шешкен жөн деп санаймын.
Building Kazakhstan's first nuclear power plant isn't only a financial and engineering question, it's a political one, rooted directly in the history we examined in the first half of this video. In October 2024, Kazakhstani authorities held a public referendum on nuclear power plant construction. Official figures reported 71% of voters in favor. Critics cited a lack of transparency in vote counting. Advocacy groups and civil society organizations raised concerns about the process. The opposition wasn't abstract or ideological. It came from the same place the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement came from, lived experience. Kazakhstan hosted more than 450 nuclear detonations. The Semipalatinsk test site produced cancers, birth defects, and environmental contamination whose full extent remains unknown, partly because the data still sits in classified Russian archives.
В моей семье до меня еще было 2 детей, которые не дожили до года. И когда родился я, то моя мать была в шоке, она 3 дня не могла подойти ко мне. Вот. Ей врачи предлагали, что, может быть, сделаем укол, и не будет не мучиться ни он, ни вы. Но отец, он отказался, он сказал, что я заберу тебя из этого роддома.
Karibek Kuyukov, Kazakhstan's ambassador for its Atom Nuclear Abolition Initiative, was born without arms as a result of radiation exposure from the polygon. He paints with his feet and his mouth. When Kazakhstanis hear Russian nuclear technology on our territory, they're not hearing an abstract geopolitical proposition. They're hearing it against 4 decades of that history.
Потому что у меня есть серия портретов таких же жертв в Семипалатинске, которые живут в Семипалатинске, которые родились больными. Я нарисовал их, и я хотел призвать людей, чтобы они вгляделись в глаза этих людей и задумались, почему этим людям пришлось перенести всю эту трагедию через себя.
The location of the planned nuclear power plant adds another layer of concern. The facility is slated for a seismically active zone, a point raised by critics during the public debate in the lead up to the referendum. Rosatom's record on comparable projects elsewhere has not been reassuring. Its construction of the new reactor units at Turkey's Akuyu plant has been troubled.
oranın inşaatında çalışan işçiler yaklaşık 3 aydır maaşlarını alamıyorlar ve bunun için tepkilerini ortaya koymak istediler. Bir protesto gerçekleştiriyorlardı ama jandarmanın müdahalesi oldu, hem de çok sert bir müdahale.
Financial delays, sanctions-related payment blockages to subcontractors, equipment delivery disruptions, labor protests over unpaid wages, and contractor difficulties have all been documented. These are not minor operational setbacks. They reflect the same structural pressures that collapsed CHP negotiations in Kazakhstan. Russian energy infrastructure companies operating under wartime financial strain, cut off from the Western supply chains, managing a geopolitical footprint that they can no longer reliably fund. Kazakhstan has not bet everything on Rosatom. In addition to the Russian-led nuclear power plant, Astana is pursuing 2 additional nuclear facilities in cooperation with China's CNNC, China National Nuclear Corporation. For CNNC, these would represent some of its first overseas power plant projects, a significant step in China's effort to export its nuclear technology internationally. The CHP episode is instructive here too. When Inter-RAO Export withdrew, Samruk Energo didn't delay. It moved to the Kazakh-Singaporean consortium with Chinese technology. Chinese firms such as China Energy Engineering and Power China are the likely equipment suppliers. The transition was managed without significant disruption to project timelines. This pattern, Russia withdrawing, China moving into the gap, is not specific to energy infrastructure. It reflects a broader shift in Kazakhstan's investment landscape. According to Satpayev's analysis, the Netherlands currently leads foreign direct investment in Kazakhstan at $2.88 billion. China follows at $2.6 billion. Russia has fallen to third at $2.1 billion. Satpayev's projection, China could emerge as Kazakhstan's leading source of foreign direct investment within 5 to 6 years. Russia's retreat from Kazakhstan's investment landscape has been accelerating since the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom imposed sanctions on major Russian oil and gas companies, Lukoil, Transneft, and Tatneft, all of which had significant investment positions in Kazakhstan. The effect is compounded over time. Satpayev charts Russian investment activity in Kazakhstan through several distinct phases. From 2022 to 2024, Russian investment actually rose as Russian businesses relocated to Kazakhstan to evade Western sanctions. That generated a temporary boom. By 2025, that effect was exhausting itself. Russian investment inflows fell from $1.2 billion to $180 million over 9 months. In 2026, stagnation is the most likely trajectory. Putin's state visit to Kazakhstan, scheduled for May 2026, will almost certainly produce declarations about expanded Russian investment. Satpayev's framing, and it's a useful one, is that the most important question isn't what gets announced, but what gets built. Among genuinely new large-scale Russian projects in Kazakhstan, only 2 stand out: the nuclear power plant and Gazprom's investment in gas pipelines serving Kazakhstan's northern and northeastern regions. Gazprom's own financial position has been unstable in recent years. Whether either project proceeds on schedule at projected cost and with Russian financing intact is, at minimum, an open question. 3 things are worth watching closely as Kazakhstan's nuclear story develops. The first is whether the Rosatom NPP project survives its 2029 groundbreaking date intact. Every indicator from the CHP episode, financing delays, equipment constraints, sanctions pressures on Russian energy companies, misaligned expectations about cost recovery, applies with equal or greater force to the $15 billion reactor project. Kazakhstan has already demonstrated it will move on rather than wait indefinitely. If the nuclear plant timeline begins to slip, expect China's CNNC to become the more prominent conversation. And this month brought a relevant data point. The Kazakhstani government announced plans to build at least 3 nuclear power plants by 2050, which suggests that Astana is no longer treating the Rosatom project as the only path forward, but as the opening move in a much longer energy strategy.
В Казахстане должен работать международный консорциум, который будет состоять из мировых компаний, обладающих самыми передовыми технологиями.
The second is domestic politics around nuclear energy. The 2024 referendum didn't resolve public unease. It papered over it. A survey conducted by the Kazakhstan Institute for Strategic Studies in August 2024 found that roughly a third of Kazakhstanis oppose nuclear power plant construction, with accident risk and environmental damage as the primary concerns. Importantly, that opposition wasn't concentrated around the former test site. It was distributed across all 17 regions in the country's 3 largest cities. In Kazakhstan, nuclear policy still passes through memories of bodily risk and official secrecy that no referendum result simply erases. Any significant incident, a financial scandal, an equipment failure, a construction delay, has the potential to reignite organized opposition in a country that is already navigating a political transition. The third is what Kazakhstan's posture on nuclear weapons tells us about its posture on nuclear energy. At the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, Tokayev announced that the real danger in Iran conflict isn't freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, it's nuclear proliferation.
We should focus first of all on the nutshell of the problem. The nutshell of the problem is the spreading out of nuclear technologies and nuclear arms. This problem must be in the very center of our negotiations as far as we are talking about Iran's conflict. But now we have switched to discussing the issues of the global trade. It's okay.
He applied Kazakhstan's established anti-nuclear doctrine to a live geopolitical crisis, and he did it in front of an international audience. That's not incidental. Kazakhstan's entire claim to diplomatic credibility on nuclear issues rests on the coherence between its history and its present conduct. It absorbed the consequences of the polygon. It gave up the arsenal. It hosts the IAEA uranium bank. Tokayev invoking that legacy at Antalya, days after the news broke of plans for 3 nuclear power plants by 2050, is a reminder of how carefully Astana manages the distinction between civilian nuclear use under safeguards and the spread of nuclear weapons. The referendum drew the line for a domestic audience. Antalya drew it for the world. Kazakhstan gave up nuclear weapons 30 years ago. It built its international identity around that choice. Now it's trying to acquire nuclear energy, and the path to that goal runs directly through the same geopolitical tensions the country has spent 3 decades carefully managing. The polygon is closed. The warheads are gone. But the questions they left behind about sovereignty, about great power pressure, about what it costs to remain nuclear-free in a world where the nuclear powers keep reminding you of Saddam Hussein, those questions are still very much open. Thanks for watching. This video is partially based on an analysis by Dosim Satpayev for the Turan Research Center. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read the full piece. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And let me know in the comments, do you think Kazakhstan can keep Russia and China in balance as it builds out its nuclear energy program? Or is the $15 billion Rosatom deal too big to walk away from, even if the warning signs keep mounting?